So we're gonna continue looking at pattern matching and looking at matching fabric that features sort of in or on the main garment pieces. So in this case, we're going to be looking at a welt pocket. Now, a welt pocket, for those who don't know, is so it's called an inset pocket. So the pocket's on the underside of the fabric. And it's normally framed with one or two very slim pieces of fabric that create the pocket opening, and it's a really lovely, very professional, very sleek finish. So we're going to look at how we get this part pattern matched with the rest of the fabric. So I have a pattern that's been printed out by my A4 printer, and it's just used standard copy paper. So this is quite thick, and you may already be able to instantly see that it's very hard to see the pattern through this paper. You add 2 layers to it and it's going to be almost impossible. Okay, so I guess the first thing I would say, if you were using this sort of paper, is that if you wanted to pattern match, what would be a really good idea is to get some tissue paper or some tracing paper or some proper dressmaker's paper, and to trace out the different bits that you may need, so that you end up with a much finer grade paper to work with. That said, I would typically do that if the pattern was busy, but in this case we've got stripes. So if you've got a pattern that's got horizontal or vertical stripes or both, you can actually use a slightly different approach to it. So I'm just going to show you how to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to pin this main garment piece to this fabric, and I've chosen a stripy one to work with. So I'm going to pin that, and then I'll show you what to do next. Right, so I've pinned this loosely, and I'm going to start looking at where we want to place the welt pocket. Now, if you've got a pattern that has either vertical or horizontal lines, what you can do is utilize those lines to place your pattern pieces. So in this instance, we've got vertical lines going down on the fabric, and we've got 2 vertical lines against that grain line on this welt, which means on here we've got the same thing going on. So what you can do with your pattern is place it on the fabric and take a ruler and just make sure that those grain lines and those vertical lines are absolutely aligned. And if you're working with horizontal lines and there's slightly more fabric, then you would use this part of the fabric to line it up, and that will give you a beautifully matched pocket or whatever you're working with to play with and to sew into the garment. So I'm just going to now pin that, and that's what I would do to get this perfectly aligned. So that's method 1. So it gets a little bit more complicated when you're working with both horizontal and vertical lines. So in front of me I've got a nice check fabric here that not only has different width of stripes, but there's different colours involved as well. And this is where we would have to do a slightly more complicated bit of pattern matching. Right, so as before, I'm using a pattern that has been printed out using copy paper, so there isn't a huge amount of transparency coming through the paper. So I need to place my my welt, and what I can't do is solely rely on either the vertical or the horizontal lines, because I need to consider the opposite line when matching this fabric. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to overlay where this welt features on the main garment piece. and I'm going to pin it into position. Just going to pin it in quite loosely, but making sure that all of those lines are joined up. Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so that's now all in position. As I said before, if you were to be working with a much busier pattern, then I would suggest that you trace these pattern pieces onto a thinner, more transparent piece of paper. However, because these lines are straight and on the grain line, it makes our life a little bit easier. So what you're going to need to do is get yourself a ruler and a couple of different colour pens or pencils, and we're going to draw directly onto the pattern. Now, if you don't have a nice long ruler, what you can do is unpin very carefully the pattern and fold it out of the way so you have slightly closer access to this. But if you do have a nice long ruler, then I suggest that we use this to get this marked up. So I have deliberately chosen a black biro and a red pen as well. Now, what I wanted to do was to use the black biro on these darker lines, and I'll use the red pen on these lighter lines to create a nice crosshatch pattern for me to match up at a different point. So I'm going to start off with the black pen here, and I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to join this line to this line, and I'm just going to draw it across the welt pattern piece. I don't need to go all the way through to the main garment. I'm just working on this welt pattern as it sits on the garment. So I'm going to do that, and then I will show you the result. Right, so this has now been marked up and it looks a little bit busy, but don't worry, it will look fine once you've got it placed on the fabric. So I'm going to unpin that. So we now no longer need the welt attached to the front piece, and I'm going to find a suitable bit of placement for this. Now, this is quite a small pattern repeat, so we should be able to use what we've got here. Now, if you remember, these red lines represent the cream lines on the fabric, and then the biro lines represent the darker ones. So I'm now going to look at positioning this against all of those different lines. Okay, so here we've got these dark lines coming off the pattern there, and we've got the cream lines going up and across, and that there is perfect. So I'm going to pin that into position, and that will give us a perfectly pattern matched check on a pocket or a welt or something that sits on top of the fabric or inside the fabric that is visible on the right side.